Welcome, Chosen X. You arrive beneath a ceiling of hush where lessons have been kept from easy sight. A plain lamp hangs here, and a strip of glass will show you what you cannot face in passing. This room does not flatter you with false consolation. It offers clarity and a method for attending to wounds that once taught you how to give without measure. You learn the cost of boundless mercy and the slow erosion that follows a generous habit without guard. Over many nights you tested new forms of care and refusal, and those experiments remade your map of obligation and rest. Once familiar faces leaned close as if in need and left as soon as appetite was satisfied. You stopped mistaking craving for affection and chose to read behavior as evidence. You redrew the line around your life on the basis of repeated gestures rather than single speeches. The practice of counting responses taught you how truth often arrives in pattern. Generosity that lasts requires terms and an attention that will not be wasted. Anger that formerly flooded you was reshaped into a tempering heat that clarified resolve rather than into a blaze that burned bridges without purpose. You learned to place boundaries with the same care you once placed gifts. The hours that used to hollow you became laboratories where motive could be parsed and tested. Memory kept a ledger, and the entries taught you how reciprocity looks over time. Daily modest acts of repair outperformed grand proclamations. You reinforced agreements and allowed inconsistent promises to fall silent without converting absence into accusation. That silence preserved compassion by preventing surrender. Mercy remained available even as access to your inner life required qualification. Protection proved not to exclude but to conserve the tender parts that enable future giving. As you adopted these habits, your presence acquired a new gravity. People reacted with either distance or relief. Some retreated because the old loopholes were gone, and others leaned in because steadiness made mutuality legible. New allies arrived whose actions matched words and whose nearness multiplied rather than sapped your energy. Those relationships turned into vessels where you practiced braver offerings and deeper witness. Love that once felt porous became contained so that it could sustain rather than dissipate. You did not arrive here by accident. Your ethics were forged through repeated small experiments that corrected earlier assumptions. Each correction sharpened discernment and reclaimed appetite for beauty without exposing tenderness to exploitation. You began to hold desire like a tool to be handled with care rather than like a wound that demanded salving by every passerby. That distinction opened access to creativity and to a steadier generosity that resisted collapse and allowed new projects to breathe. There were nights when solitude returned as a raw ache and required delicate tending. You built rituals that honored grief but refused to let sorrow become identity. Mourning practices rewove threads of possibility, and small pledges to yourself created a ledger of trust. Keeping those promises tuned the instrument of your patience so you could honor others without dissolving into codependency. Self-stewardship became the axis from which public offerings rotated, and responsibility could be practiced without self-annihilation. This chamber insists upon another truth about shadow. The aspects of you that once unsettled people are not failures to be removed but capacities to be disciplined. Darkness becomes a responsible skill when it is nested within a moral architecture. Align fierce clarity with steady empathy, and you make space that protects without annihilating. That alignment shows up in how you close doors that would hollow you and in how you remain present with those who refuse to exploit your restraint. Power that carries care is difficult to attack. By the close of this phase you will understand that restoration is not a return to what was but an invention of what can be. Repair proceeds in measures that are tiny and relentless. Embody the practice of conserving self while extending care. The next trials will require you to translate these private disciplines into public patterns and systems. For now, remain in this chamber and steward the lessons you have learned so they can anchor the days ahead. You will learn that quiet acts become radical when they are repeated. A measured refusal to be available without reciprocity can travel farther than spectacle. Each refusal instructs those who treated your warmth as an inexhaustible resource. As you protect reserves, you model generosity that requires consent and mutual effort. Small consistencies accumulate into influence. A single disciplined habit reshapes expectation and makes new alliances viable. This work is not a drama. It is the long practice of choosing integrity over applause. When you exit this room, you will carry markers for investing attention and for whom to invite into the next circle. You will also carry the sober knowledge that some cannot meet these terms and must be left to their own devices. Rest in the fact that what looked like loss was reallocation towards sustaining what truly thrives. The shards you gathered here are now the scaffolding for future giving. Guard that architecture and refuse the impulse to dilute its form. The upcoming trials will test these rules under pressure, and if you hold them, you will step into wider stewardship. You step beyond the chamber carrying a ledger of careful practices and a new standard for reciprocity. The first tests you meet outside do not arrive as storms but as small knots in daily life that ask you to measure response. People will solicit your time with soft tones and practiced stories. Some offers will come with follow-through and some will fade after the initial request. Waiting for evidence is not cruelty. It is a deliberate method that preserves creative capacity and prevents your attention from being siphoned away by performative need. This pause lets you allocate care where it will multiply rather than dissipate. Those who would consume thinly cloak appetite in language that resembles intimacy. They cite shared history and summon pity as currency. Your responsibility is to test such claims against repeated behavior. Ask for moments when inconvenience was born rather than merely narrated. Observe whether apologies are paired with repair. These modest metrics spare you from endless obligations and reveal who is prepared to match care with labor. You will also encounter people whose responses are steady and proportionate. These allies do not rush your recovery or demand public affirmation. They mirror restraint and offer support that scales with cost. They do not mistake mercy for permission to extract, and they do not require gratitude as payment. In their company you may extend resources that regenerate rather than deplete. Such relationships become laboratories for practice and mutual maturation. In this season you refine a craft that reads the aperture between claim and follow-through. Your perception becomes a tool that discerns character over time. You use concise language to set expectations, and you favor agreements that require follow-up. Short, clear commitments reduce ambiguity and protect goodwill. When you state a limit, you also provide an available consequence that is proportionate and predictable. Consequences are not punitive retribution. They are corrective architecture that trains systems to respect limits. Fatigue distorts interpretation. When exhaustion mounts, small slights swell into indictments of your worth. Attend rhythms that restore perspective. Sleep and steady nourishment, brief movement and concentrated study recalibrate the mind so that discernment is not hijacked by depletion. Recovery practices are not indulgence. They are maintenance for service. They keep the instrument tuned so that generosity remains sustainable. Keep a running inventory of alignment. Note when words and deeds cohere and when they split. Review these entries with calm curiosity. This audit is data rather than drama. Patterns will reveal structural lessons about who contributes to your flourishing and who drains it. Use those lessons to realign attention and to design rituals that guard your reserves. Rituals need not be ornate. They can be simple marked acts that signal both welcome and refusal with equal clarity. Anticipate pushback. Those who profited from easy access will test new boundaries with increasingly clever appeals. Your defense should not be merely reactionary. Provide preemptive clarity by stating terms before engagements and by modeling the behaviors you request. The steadiness of your practice will educate the environment and reduce future incursions. Over time, consistent action will recalibrate social expectations in your circles. This period asks you to convert intermittent discipline into habit. Habit builds character by making moral acts automatic under pressure. Ritualize salutations of permission as you ritualize your refusals. Let limits become as familiar as welcome. When this happens, the people who matter will adapt and those who cannot will separate. Both outcomes are useful, information that frees capacity for deeper work. When you complete this stage, you will not have eliminated need or conflict, but you will have purchased clarity. You will learn to channel attention where it multiplies life and away from what merely consumes. Your generosity will sharpen into stewardship and your reserves will support larger undertakings. The next phase will ask you to teach these practices so that private repair becomes shared resilience. You will be invited to translate private habits into public patterns. Begin by naming small protocols aloud and by demonstrating them in ordinary tasks. Invite a trusted handful to practice the forms with you and iterate until the ritual feels natural. This sharing is not vanity. It is replication that protects others from needless loss. As you scale these patterns, influence will follow because clarity and humility create practices that endure. Serve not to dominate but to enlarge the field where care can flourish. Keep tending this work with patience and precision, and the communities you touch will inherit steadier habits for life. You descend into a private library of feeling where old scripts and unfinished sentences accumulate like dust on a shelf. In this archive you meet voices that once kept you safe by insisting on caution, voices that now limit the range of your longing if left unexamined. Approach them with steady curiosity rather than with shame, and you will gather precise information about what those lines protected you from and what they now prevent you from becoming. Attend to the textures of those memories. Some are brittle and quick to shatter under scrutiny, while others hold a strange elasticity that reveals hidden possibilities. Trace the edges where guilt has been sewn to identity, and you will find the stitches that can be loosened. Translate the language of fear into questions that reveal facts rather than fictions. Ask what proof exists for each old decree and tally the instances where it no longer serves. This inventory is exacting work, but it returns clarity that can be relied upon. You will encounter internal narrators that critique every proposal as reckless and each tenderness as dangerous. Listen long enough to hear their pattern and then invite them into the workshop where evidence is gathered and alternatives are modeled. Replace punitive scripts with experimental protocols that simulate outcomes in small, controlled ways. When a new choice produces a different result, you will have the data to rewrite the internal law. Beware the twin traps of rage and sentimentality. Rage can clarify where boundaries were violated and incentivize repair, but unchanneled it consumes resources and provokes destruction. Sentimentality can preserve connection but risks surrendering autonomy. Treat both as temporary instruments, use the heat of resentment to delineate limits, and employ tenderness as a measured resource that resists depletion. Over time your responses will feel proportionate rather than reactive. Practice translating narrative into policy. When a memory suggests an automatic boundary, convert that intuition into a test that can be applied in real time. Design small commitments you can keep that demonstrate a revised rule so that you learn through doing rather than through argument. Repetition builds neural pathways that make new choices accessible under stress. Invite companions into this laboratory with caution. Seek witnesses who model steadiness and who will speak truth without extracting attention for selfish reasons. A small circle of tempered allies will function as a calibration system that helps you see distortions and confirms genuine shifts. Feedback that is generous and precise will accelerate the renovation of inner architecture. Allow for gradual reintegration. Some old parts will reconcile quickly while others resist. Do not rush reconciliation for the sake of coherence. Contain experiments within boundaries that ensure safety and only widen them after evidence of stability appears. This measured expansion protects fragile gains and prevents relapse into old surrender patterns. You will notice new signals in daily life as the inner work proceeds. Slight discomfort where you once acquiesced will appear earlier and give you time to choose differently. Instances of gratitude will no longer feel like debts to repay with availability but as mutual exchanges that honor limits. Opportunities will emerge that align with the rhythm of preservation and expansion. Honor grief as an honest teacher. Tears are not failures, they are the solvent that clears residue so fresh commitments can stick. Sit with the ache so that decisions come from integration rather than from avoidance. Rituals that mark release will help you move through seasons with dignity and not drama. As your interior laws shift, you will gain a quieter competence that refuses to perform. Authority will not arrive as thunder but as a steady capacity to manage complexity without sacrificing tenderness. Others may misread this calm as indifference. Trust the results of your practice instead of the temporary judgments of onlookers. When this chapter closes, you will hold a map of old wounds annotated with experiments and their outcomes. That map will guide the next stage where you scale these methods outward into the shared domains you inhabit. For now remain in the workshop, tending the slow alchemy of inner repair, because the strength you build here will sustain the responsibilities that await. Integrate practical vows that bind your hands in service to new ordinances. Name specific experiments and record outcomes so that personal lore becomes usable instruction for action. Let scars become syllables in a language you read fluently. Let their rhythm guide compassionate enforcement rather than reflex. Keep a ledger of promises to self and to a few witnesses, and let that ledger be the test for larger commitments. Close this phase by affirming a concise code you can repeat and refine. Carry that code into the next stage as the scaffold for practice. You arrive at a season where practice has become a habit and habit has become a repository of authority. Days follow patterns that were once deliberate experiments and now function as steady architecture that supports both care and resistance. Your choices have crystallized into forms. What used to require effort now requires only attention. In this stage you learn how to hold power without spectacle and to let influence be steady rather than dramatic. Your life is organized around small sacred protocols that mark transitions and preserve capacity. Morning habits are less about performance and more about calibration. You greet obligations with an inner checklist that protects reserves and prevents impulsive giving. Evenings are used to reconcile where energy moves and to adjust the distribution of your attention. These rituals are not rigid prescriptions but practical scaffolds that sustain generosity while preventing erosion. Authority here looks like reliability. You no longer assert dominance, you show up and finish tasks that matter. People begin to trust you because your words align with outcomes. That congruence repels manipulative patterns and invites serious collaborators who match effort with intention. You create contexts where promises are meaningful and where people learn to carry their share of responsibility because doing so is the price of proximity. Teachable moments become your primary contribution. You translate private disciplines into observable forms and invite others to practice them. You model how to refuse without shame and how to accept without overcommitting. Your calibrations are precise. You set expectations clearly, you name consequences transparently, and you follow through with measured consistency. Those who cannot align step back, those who can step forward and join the field. You also refine the language of mercy. Your compassion manifests as refined discernment rather than indiscriminate availability. You distinguish between temporary distress and pattern demand. That discernment is taught through example and through simple protocols that make consent explicit. In time groups you respond to these protocols with increased maturity because the forms protect them as well. Power in this season is paired with humility. You understand that stewardship requires listening more than display. You hold your authority as a resource to allocate rather than as a throne to defend. This mindset shapes the way you convene others. Gatherings are structured, short, and purposefully restorative. People leave these spaces less depleted and more able to contribute. Rituals of repair receive communal status. Small acts of restoration are normalized and repeated until they become cultural currency. When harm occurs, there is a predictable process for redress that emphasizes learning over endless justification. This pattern reduces drama and increases actual repair. Under pressure, your composure is visible. You do not perform calm, you embody it because the practices have rewired reactivity into disciplined response. Tests that once produced chaos now reveal meticulous problem solving. Each test becomes an opportunity to demonstrate how steadiness can transform a crisis into a learning event. As influence grows, you are careful to maintain personal boundaries that reflect your capacity. You refuse to let role inflate into identity. Humility keeps power from calcifying into arrogance. You maintain personal time and private thresholds so that public work does not consume interior life. You will also cultivate apprentices who learn by practice and example, documenting small victories and failures so forms remain usable rather than merely emblematic. Encourage redundancy so no right depends on a single keeper, and build compact toolkits for repair, an apology language that acknowledges damage, an ordered sequence for restitution that restores trust through acts rather than promises, and a simple cadence for reconciliation that preserves dignity. Expect setbacks and treat them as information. When systems falter, examine processes rather than assign blame. Iterate with modest steps that conserve morale and protect privacy. Record the rituals that work along with signs that a protocol needs revision. Keep witnesses who can attest to both practice and outcome. When you scale, these small documents will translate private habits into public infrastructure. The endurance you fashion here is not a claim to superiority, it is a protocol for sheltering more people. Carry it forward with tenderness and precision. You stand at the threshold where private labor becomes public offering and where what you learned in silence now serves others. The work you have done to shape edges and refine responses becomes the architecture that shelters more than your own heart. You are asked to translate practice into service so the protections you built for yourself become accessible without demanding sacrifice from those you intend to guard. This is not a spectacle of virtue. It is a careful conversion of repair into durable forms that others can inhabit. Communities gather around forms that are clear because they produce safety. Create systems simple enough to teach and subtle enough to resist exploitation. Teach the language of consent for giving and receiving. Model rituals that mark repair and return. Make practices ordinary so they can be repeated by those with little time and so profound that they reframe how a life is lived. Allow your methods to be tested and improved through witness and honest refinement. As influence grows, you will confront resistance that is not always overt. Some resent the clarity you demand because it reveals their own neglect. Others will attempt to co-opt the forms for private advantage. Keep a public ledger of intent and outcome and correct what drifts. Use transparent measures so systems remain accountable to those with the least power. When leaders fall short, call them back through structured remediation rather than spectacle. Preserve the dignity of repair. There will be hours when stewardship feels like a solitary mantle. In those moments, return to the small practices that root you, brief vows that can be revised, short gatherings for testimony, and a private liturgy that returns you to the source of repair. Invite a handful of steady witnesses who will remind you of commitments when fatigue frays resolve. Remember that delegation is not abandonment. Build redundancies so care outlives any single keeper. Teach by example and by accessible instruction. Translate personal protocols into templates others can adapt. Offer frameworks so people learn to steward attention well. Do not mistake scale for depth. Guard against expansion that sacrifices the quality of shelter for the quantity of recipients. Prioritize depth in initial sites and allow growth through careful replication rather than haste. Part of stewardship is speaking truth to illusion with compassion. When you accuse, do so with clarity and with steps for repair. When you bless, do so with boundaries that preserve the blessed space. Your authority is not the right to obliterate resistance but the responsibility to kindle places where repair can occur. Hold accountability and mercy together and encourage structures that make both visible. Occasionally convene public rituals that name harm and that model restitution. Design these moments to uplift witnesses rather than to punish. Celebrate those who keep covenants and keep the path back open yet demanding. Ritualize acts that restore trust through labor so that reconciliation is earned and not merely declared. At a certain moment, a moving image will appear centered in your view, a visual lesson that gathers many of the practices into concentrated demonstration. This presentation is a composed invitation not to sell content but to deepen enactment through modeled exercises. When the image surfaces, treat it as another chamber in the school. The demonstration will include templates for agreements, clear exercises in repair and guided enactments you can practice. If you choose to enter that room, the sequence will accelerate your learning and connect you to a lineage of practice transmitted through repetition. Subscribing to receive future transmissions is a promise to show up for the work. Activating notifications is a small pledge that your days will be shaped by discipline rather than by intermittent urgency. These choices are not consumption. They are commitments to apprenticeship. A covenant like this depends on ordinary acts repeated over time. Steward the modest rhythms that sustain people. Honor each person who arrives with fragility and welcome them into forms that heal without allowing exploitation. Let your leadership be measured by how many lives are steadier because of what you taught. The final charge is practical and tender. Continue to guard inner thresholds while you extend outward. Keep teaching small protocols and refine them through witness. Call people into participation rather than into dependence. Protect what you have built by insisting on shared labor and by refusing rituals that center ego. When you feel weary, remember that the disciplined acts you repeat will outlast moments of acclaim and will become the inheritance of those who follow. This is your stewardship. Carry it forward with care. Hold these practices as a promise to the future. Let each small faithful act be a stone in the path that leads others from fragmentation to steadiness. Keep tending. Ever.